Well, hey, everybody, my name is Justin Kegley, and welcome to the F.A.S.T Masterclass. We are super pumped to be able to have this tonight and to bring to you information on how we can help make your daughter faster and also reduce the risk of injury for her while she's playing sports. We are super pumped. My name is Justin Kegley. I've been working with athletes for the better part of 15 years and have had the opportunity to work with athletes across all spectrums. We've worked with athletes throughout their season and in the preseason, help them to build up to high-level athletics. We've also had the availability to work with athletes that have had significant injuries, that have torn their ACLs, and work on the back end of that to figure out how do we help them to get better and to come back off of that. So you have a unique sense of information and knowledge and experience to be able to bring this information to you, to not only talk about how we can help be faster and stronger, but also to reduce the risk of injury. Because look, if you want to be a better athlete, you need to be able to stay on the field or court longer. That's the first rule of sport, is reduce the risk of injury as much as possible. So I'm super pumped about this tonight to be able to bring this to you. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to share this with you. I'm going to share a deck, and we're going to go through how we can help to make your daughter faster, but also reduce the risk of her injury. So here we go. Share this. All right. I think we, pardon me, need to get out of that and do this. Sorry, a little technical difficulty. All right, so we're going to start that from the beginning. All right, so here we go. Let's try this again. Share that. All right, so maximizing your daughter's performance while reducing the risk of injury. So, all right, here we go. See, we know that it's really important for us to build resilient athletes, because it doesn't matter if someone gets faster and stronger and has success in their sport if they're unable to stay on the field or court. Getting hurt is a significant problem in sports these days. We know that our kids specialize earlier than ever. And so what ends up happening is we have repetitive issues, we have just overuse issues and injuries. And so looking at how we can reduce the risk of injury is a significant issue for us. We know that right now there's about 200 to 250,000 total ACL tears throughout the country annually. And that is a significant problem. And when we look at training the female athletes, we know that they have a higher prevalence of risk than a male does, up to 6 times more likely to tear their ACL. So we want to make sure that we help a female athlete to not only get stronger and faster and better, but also to help them to reduce the risk of that injury. So here's the thing. When we put this out, we asked some questions. And, we had some feedback. And so looking at this, we go, how do we do a couple things? Can we train males and females the same? Will my daughter bulk up? Will lifting weights stunt her growth? The always tough schedule question, right? So I'm going to go through a couple of these and answer this kind of thing, all right? So number one, of course, all of this depends on the professional that you're working with. Hiring a professional trainer makes a significant amount of difference, okay? Because we know that we can train athletes young from a resistance and a strength and conditioning perspective. It has been shown to be very safe and very effective. But what we need to do is make sure that the prescribed training is good for them, and that it is appropriate for their age and what their sport is and what they're doing. So when we look at this, do we train male and female athletes the same? The answer for us is yes. So when we look at the physiology and how we train an athlete, like we look at each individual person and we want to make sure that we are addressing them as appropriate. But what's important is to make sure that they get the same things, that we work on making sure that we move well first, making sure that we develop great patterns and then get stronger and that we continue to help develop in techniques so that way they can continue to get faster and to be able to absorb more force and things like that. So we absolutely want to make sure that we train females and males the same. Now, for some of you, you're like, especially for dads, you're probably out there going like, oh, you know, like we train differently in football and it was a little crazy. Well, the things have advanced and evolved. And so if you're training, or so the person that's training your daughter potentially like has not evolved, then that's a problem, right? So because we can do plenty of things that can help your athlete get faster, get stronger without having to increase the risk of injury. You know, one of the things for us is we have a significant amount of female athletes, and we don't back squat with them because we don't think it's appropriate in that realm, right? So we want to train them up. We want to help them to develop strength, but it's not a matter of how do we create this, you know, crazy atmosphere where they're trying to lift tons of weight, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing what's appropriate for each person. Will your daughter bulk up? And if we're doing the right things, if we're eating well and continue to train alongside all of your other sports, the answer is no. In and of itself, a good strength and conditioning program should help her to get stronger, and it should be additive to whatever movements she does in her sport. But should it bulk her up? The answer is no. Because what happens, this is not a powerlifting or a bodybuilding routine, right, where we're trying to rep out for significant amounts of rep. We're trying to nail the formula right so that way we get stronger and we increase our ability to produce force, but it's not necessarily about getting bulky in size. Now, as someone matures and gets older, they absolutely will put on some muscle. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to hulk up and look like the Incredible Hulk. So absolutely not. Will lifting weights stunt my daughter's growth? This is a great question because it's kind of a fable and something that we have heard for years. Lifting weights will stunt your growth. It absolutely will not. It has not ever been proven in one scientific study. In fact, there are significant amounts of studies that have been done in this realm that prove that strength and conditioning done well will not have an effect on your daughter or anyone's growth, right? So we want to protect and make sure the growth plates are protected. But in essence, the amount of load or force that it would take would be significant. And so there would be a far greater issue rather than just a stunting of the growth at that point. So, and then the final question is, how do you train while you're playing sports? And so this is something that is a significant issue because right now in America, one of the things that we do is we develop players rather than athletes at this point. So we have a significant amount of kids that play soccer, play basketball, play baseball, but fewer and fewer play multiple sports. And that takes away, from a player's development overall. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that we're continuing to put the athlete in different environments to make sure they don't get those overuse and repetitive injuries. So we need to find the time, and hopefully if you have a team or sport or coach that can do that well, they should be able to do that because that's something that needs to continue throughout the course of the year because not only is it about good performance, it's about reducing the risk of injury. So if you have an additional question, I'd love for you to send them to me. You can send them to Justin at movementfitnessrockford.com. Would love to answer any questions you have there. Moving on. So who wants to reduce the risk of your daughter getting hurt? Everybody, I'm assuming. Yep. So, and then who wants to help their daughter get faster, right? Who wants to help your daughter get faster? Say I. There you go. Great. Absolutely. So we want to do both. So how can we do that? Look, a torn ACL is the #1 reason that women miss time from athletics. A female is up to 6 times more likely to tear their ACL than males. And here's the reason why. Since this has become such a big issue in the United States, especially because when Title IX went in 1972, there has been a 900-time increase in the amount of females that are playing sports. So there's been this massive boom of females playing sports, and that is tremendous. It's great. We're just super encouraged by that. But what has happened is concurrently, they often don't get the training that goes along with that male sports often gets. I don't know if it's a stigma or there's lots of reasons for it, but reducing the risk of injury for females is significant. If you look at the statistics, 1 in 60 high school females will tear their ACL. That is a significant number, right? So here's the good news, though. So I don't want to be Debbie Downer. The good news is we can reduce the risk of injury by up to 70%, right? When we look at how injuries happen on the field or court, we can make a significant amount of damage on reducing the risk of injury, right? So taking it down by 70% is a significant number. If I could tell you you could reduce any injury by 70%, as a parent of an athlete, you should say, yes, I am in. I want that. It makes a huge difference. The number will never be zero. No number will ever be zero when it comes to injury in sports. So, but it will take some time. It does take some effort, and it does take some very specific and strategic things to make that happen. So, again, my name is Justin Kegley. I put this in there. Owner of Movement Fitness Rockford, the Rockford Speed Coach. Super excited to be with you here today. So, just a little background, 15 years as a personal trainer. We talked about that at the beginning. Spent a significant amount of time working with ACL injuries, both hands-on and helping females return to sport after ACL. And then also we've had over 500 athletes that have come through our doors at Movement Fitness in the last 3.5 years. So we have had a significant amount of work with athletes on the front end of that too. I was voted the What Rocks Personal Trainer of the Year for Rockford, and I am passionate about helping a population in need. So here's the deal. This is an area that I think is so underserved, right? We know that this is a major issue that's plaguing female athletes, but we can do something about it. And I'm passionate about helping females to reduce the risk of tearing their ACL and getting better at their sport simultaneously, because I feel like they're shortchanged. And I feel like we've had so many female athletes that have walked through these doors that have made such significant strides, not only in their athletics, but in their confidence and who they are. And they're able to go on and achieve things that they wouldn't have done before. And we are just, so inspired by them and passionate about helping them. And that's one of the things, that's the reason why we're doing this call and this talk. And so super pumped about that. So here we go. Moving forward fast, this is our female ACL prevention and speed training. That is what we call this. So we have worked with a significant amount of females, and so we work to maximize performance and minimize injury there. So here's a couple reasons for the higher risk. You ask, why do females have such an issue with ACL tears? And there's a couple specific things. There are some things that we can't control, and there are some that we can. And so we'll talk about that. Number one, something physiologically just happens is the Q angle, which is the hips, are wider than a male's, right? So when we look at the hips relative to the rest of the skeleton, it creates this downward and inward direction of the knee. So it causes a valgus position, we call it, right? So their knees are automatically pointing in and together. And so when you look at that, and when someone stops and their knee is rotated in, when they hit the brakes really hard, they're trying to change direction in a sport or game or something like that, or they land and they can't absorb that force and the knee's already going in, man, that's a significant issue. And that's one of the reasons why females tear their ACL. Unfortunately, we can't change the Q angle of the hip. We can't change the size of somebody's hip and the way it's structured. So there is one of those things to be aware of. Two is females have a smaller ACL. So they actually have a smaller ACL than males. They have also a smaller intercondylar notch, which is the notch which the ACL goes through in the back of the knee, so those are three things that we can't control. Sorry, I can't change your ACL size. I can't change the size of the intercondylar notch, and I can't change the size of the Q angle. But here's the good news. What we can do is we can work on the final two, which is poor hip, glute, and hamstring strength, and then poor neuromuscular patterns. And see, what often happens is because the female athlete has a wider hip angle, they have a smaller, ACL, they get used to doing things in a certain pattern. And so this is actually why bad training is worse than no training, because what happens is we program something bad over and over and over and over again, and then it becomes a pattern and it gets locked into our brain. And so these poor neuromuscular patterns end up causing big time issues for us long term. So what we want to do, what we work to do for athletes is to help them to change that throughout the course of our system. So those are two things that we can change: the strength and the patterns. All right. So I just said that. Here we go. How can it be reduced, right? 70% of injuries, ACL injuries, come from non-contact. That means nobody touched them. There's nobody around. It's one of those things that everybody said, well, they just stopped, or they just landed from a jump, and then they went down in a heap, right? So unfortunately, that is not uncommon. It's actually a telltale sign when we see that. So 70% of injuries come from that. Another 15% of injuries come from when someone maybe comes down from a rebound and gets bumped, so they have indirect contact. So that makes up 85% of ACL tears in athletes, and that's significant. The other 15% come from just a direct trauma to the knee, which unfortunately there's no amount of training that can stop that. But that's generally a very, very, very small number. So 70% come from non-contact, 15% additionally come from indirect contact. So those are the numbers there. When we look at this, landing from a jump, the knees are they're in that valgus position. The knees are locked, so they may be stiff and straight, or there's a sudden stop and change in direction. That's exactly when someone tears their ACL generally. That's the majority of the time, Poor landing techniques. If you look here, Erin demonstrates this for us. Erin actually was my first ACL client. She came to us 3.5 years ago, and she had torn her ACL. She was 4.5 months post-op when we started working with her there. And she has since gone on. She was 14 at the time when she came to us. And she has since gone on to become a D1 soccer player, goalkeeper for the University of Akron. So she's a great athlete, great example of someone that can come back from an injury. So if you look at these patterns here, these are the poor landing techniques that we're talking about. If you look at what Erin's doing on the far left over here, her knee, she's on one leg. Her knee is in a caved in position. That's something that we often see, especially when females start off training. So not strong enough to absorb and to take that load, so the knee just automatically collapses in. Similar thing here in the middle, where you look at her knees are both going in and caving down. So that is obviously a problem when she comes down to land. She just doesn't have they're demonstrating the inability to land and absorb a force there. So consequently, the knees cave in. And then the last one is a little bit of an exaggeration here, but you see this when people land stiff-legged, they land really, really hard. That is another way and time that someone tears an ACL. So reducing the risk, these are the poor landing techniques that we see when someone tears their ACL. So how do we reduce the risk of injury? Female ACL prevention and speed training. Here we go. So bunch of stuff. You don't need to remember all this, but here's what we do. We can improve movement patterns. We talked about this in the beginning. We help people move well first. Because if we can help your athlete, your daughter, move well first, it's going to significantly reduce the risk of her getting hurt, right? So if you look at that, we want to move patterns first. To improve muscular imbalances, when you look at someone who has either bigger quads to hamstrings, or they have a left to right difference between their right and their left leg, like that's a major issue. And so we want to reduce the difference between one limb and the other limb as much as possible. So we work to make sure that we get rid of all those imbalances. the neuromuscular patterns. This is part of the movement pattern. What we work to do is we work to ingrain these patterns, and we do that through repetition. We do that over and over and over again to make sure that we are working with our athletes so that they're landing in the right position, that they're squatting in the right position, that they're able to move through the patterns that they need to before we put a load on them, before we make things harder. We're trying to groove the mind-muscle connection, so we work on neuromuscular patterns. These things are stored in the brain's motor cortex, right? So muscles don't have memory. They have neuromuscular transmission. So we work through that to make sure that we get those patterns right. So we want to reinforce the right things. So the brain will recall this when the athlete is playing their sport. That's so good. So absolutely. Here we go. Overall strength. We want to make sure that athletes get stronger, especially in their core, their hip abductor and glutes, and their hamstrings. We need to make sure that all throughout the hips and glutes, they are strong, because when you see those athletes that knees go in and they end up, buckling or caving it together, this is a problem. A lot of that comes because their hips aren't strong enough to absorb the load of a land, okay? So if they're not strong enough to absorb that load of a land, then we need to make sure that we get them stronger, and then we reduce how we help them to land and change so we groove the pattern correctly, right? Training landing patterns, just talked about that. We want to make sure that they land well. We have a series of progressions that we take our athletes through to make sure that we can work to land well from multiple different vectors. So we work on linear and lateral and vertical and rotational, because sport takes place in all planes, right? So we want to make sure that we are working with them through all planes. So we work on landing patterns. We work on training. How do we cut and change? We want to use things that are in sports and how we decelerate and re-accelerate. So that's some of the stuff. We focus on what we can control. We have 5 principles that we use in training to help your athlete to get faster, but also to reduce the risk of injury. And here's what it is. All right, we think these things actually are very similar. Okay, so here's what it is. We have a specific warm-up that we take our athletes through. We have change of direction strategies we work on, landing strategies and technique, strengthening, especially single leg, and then change of direction conditioning. This is our programming for injury reduction. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Need a little drink. So here we go. Here's what we do. These things, hip mobility, ankle mobility, we take your athlete through a warm-up that has a couple different parts. One, we activate. We work to mobilize and to stabilize, things like that. So we want to make sure that their ankles move well. We want to make sure that their hips move well, that their thoracic spine, their shoulders, and all that moves well. And then we want to make sure we stretch and bits at the beginning there. So we do that at the beginning of every single one of our workouts. We also work on our core strength, because core is so crucial to everything in sport. If you don't have a stable core, you're going to eventually have an issue. So we work to stabilize the core and strengthen every single time there. And after we do that, then we move into what we call our dynamic portion activations, right? So we start to move a little bit. We do some band abduction. Some of the stuff we do is we start to look, if you see the athletes on the screen right now in this picture, they're doing band walks, right? So this is a simple way that we work to activate the glutes of an athlete, right? So we start to just get them warmed up so that they're actually working. And so not only does their heart rate get up and, blood start pumping and all that kind of stuff, we actually activate areas that we're going to use and that are really important. So we use things like these band walks to help them to activate their glutes. Once again, that was one of the things we talked about earlier. That is a key thing for us to reduce the risk of tearing an ACL. All right, so next is the ladder drill. So we use ladder drills not for speed. We use them for neuromuscular connection. We're trying to connect patterns with our brain to our muscles. That's the biggest thing. We want to help wake our brain up, and we do that through using things like the ladder. We work on landing techniques every single time in our warm-up, and we'll take them through double leg landing, single leg landing. We'll teach them and just continue to groove those patterns over and over and over and over again. So much so that they hear us in their head when they land, right? When they're playing a sport or if they're at practice. We want to nail those things down so that they continue to do the right things every single time. We work on marching and skipping. Unfortunately, right now in our education system, we don't work a ton on fundamental patterns. So unfortunately, there are a significant amount of kids that don't know how to march and skip. But marching and skipping is fundamental to sprinting, to overall good movement actually first. But if you look at the correlation, like if you can't march and skip well, you're probably not a great sprinter. That's a really high likelihood. So we want to make sure that we take them through that every single time to not only improve the pattern, but to warm up as well. And then the last thing we do is we work on acceleration every single time an athlete is in the facility. We don't want to miss an opportunity to help them to get faster. And we do that linearly, straight ahead. We also do that laterally, so turning, changing direction, stopping, cutting. We do that every time our athletes are in. So we want to make sure that we work on those things. So that is part of our warm-up process. We put them into positions where they have to cut and change and start to do things a little bit, right? So that we warm them up and we get those patterns going. So that way they're ready and prepped. So when we go into the session, they can do that well. All right. Moving on, change of direction training. So this is a big one. This is actually huge, right? So we want to teach our athletes how to stop, change direction, and re-accelerate. This is huge. And we spend a significant amount of time teaching them how to do this. If you actually look at the picture on the screen right now, we work on this with our athletes every time we're in laterally. So that's at least 3 days a week that we work on this as a facility. And depending on how many times the athlete comes in, they'll work on this. But if you look, we go posture. The things that we think are important is posture. Then you look at hip and knee and ankle alignment, and then making sure that everything lines up is the priority. We work on nailing this position. We actually call this position our sway position. So these girls have just come back from a sprint. They're basically doing shuttles, and they've come back. They've done their sprint. They're hitting the line, and they're going to take back off the other way. If you look at them, they're all doing a great job where their hip, their knee, and their ankle are all lined up on top of each other. So they're stacked in a good position, right? And so they have an inside lean. They're in a great position to take back off. But number one, they're reducing their risk of injury by getting into this position. Two, they are going to have a great opportunity, all of them, to be able to sprint more effectively back the other way because they're in the right position. So this is how reducing injury risk, getting into the right position can actually help you become a faster and better athlete, because when you're in the right position, it allows you to change direction better and more quickly, right? So that's part of how they go together. So we have that. Change of direction positions. You look at this with lowering our hips, sitting down. We want to stay low. We want to have lean and sway in our shoulders. So staying on the balls of our feet. We don't want to be flat-footed, and we obviously don't want to be straight-legged. And then we want to make sure our ankles, this is again why our ankles need to move well, because these are the times that we need to do that and use them dynamically. All right, so jumping and landing strategies. Changing direction is one huge part of our program. Another is jumping and landing strategies. Everybody wants to jump higher. We all want to go up, but here's the problem. We need to make sure that we can come down first, okay? Because a significant amount of injuries in ACL happen when you land. We always work with our athletes first to make sure that we can put them in the best possible position to reduce that risk. So we work to put them in the best position possible, whether it's on one leg or two legs, whether we're going forward, whether we're going straight up, whether we're going side to side, bounding, jumping, hopping. We want to make sure that we can put them in the best position. If you look at how that goes, this picture here is a little dark, sorry, but if you look at Bree, actually she's in a great position because she has landed soft. Her knees are aligned over her toes. They're bent. She's not stiff-legged. She has control of her upper body posture. We talk about seeing the logo. We want to make sure that we can see logo for an athlete so that they're not hunched over and things like that. So she's actually in a really great position. Bree's a great jumper, and so she actually lands really well. So this is pretty typical for her. If you look at this, Erin is again demonstrating this, the landing techniques for us, good landing techniques. Just what I talked about with what Bree was doing is just better images. So if we look at the picture on the left, Erin is back, her ankles are dorsiflex. She had soft feet when she landed. Tall posture, still has the logo up so you can see that. She's in a great position. She could actually jump, she could land, decelerate, and reaccelerate from this position very, very, very well. If you look in the middle, same thing here. Her knees are stacked over her toes. Her hips are in a great position there. She does a great job. And then if you look over here on the single leg position, her knee is stacked over top of her foot, and her hip is in line there. So that's part of our good landing technique strategy. We want to make sure that our athletes can land in the correct position. So that's that. Now we are going to move on to strength training. What do you think of this as building the engine? If the stuff before, the decelerating, changing direction, landing well, that's kind of the putting on the brakes. You know, if you have a car, if you have a really fast car, you should have really good brakes, right? So we think of the same thing with an athlete. If we want to have a great athlete, we need to be able to, warm it up well, but then we also need to hit the brakes. We need to be able to stop, change direction, and move, because that's the way sports are. So we built the brakes on. Now we're working to build the engine. And this is increasing that glute and hip strength to decrease the risk of our knees collapsing and caving in and going into that valgus position. So the first goal that we have is for an athlete to handle their body weight, is to be able to control what they have currently on them that they carry around all the time. This is huge. We want to be able to master basic fundamental functional exercises. We want them to be able to squat well, because that's important for the hip and also for the quad, for a muscle perspective. But we also lunging, deadlifting, because that's great for the hips. And deadlifting, in a sense, for us is not about loading up a bar and going super heavy. We actually use either a kettlebell or a trap bar, a hex bar, whatever you want to call that, to put them in the best position available. So that way they're not getting loaded up and, putting more risk on them, hurting their back and things like that. So that is a fundamental pattern for us. Carries, things like farmer carries, stuff like that, we want to make sure that we can be able to move dynamically. Carries are great because we carry weight, right? So 2 hands down at our sides, we carry them 1 hand at our side, we carry them up here in a goblet in a holding position. All great, because it's basically a walking plank. It's a dynamic plank. So to be able to walk, keep the same postures as a plank, but to move while you're doing that is tremendous, because we're going to have to do that in sport anyway. So we carry a lot of things. Push-ups, push-ups, push-ups. Fundamental, basic patterns. We want to make sure we can master our push-ups first. And then we move on to things like dumbbell bench. Rowing, chin-ups are significant for us. We want to make sure that we can do those things, master our body weight first. That's the key. Okay. Next, single leg exercises. We talked about that in the beginning. Once we can master both legs, if someone can squat functionally, then what we want to do is we want to transition them into this single leg scenario. If you look at the screen here, this is Jada and Olivia and Erin, and they are doing what we call rear foot elevated split squats, RFESS. So it's a more difficult version of a split squat, but this allows us to load up that front leg. If you look at this, this is a great load for us to be able to challenge them significantly without putting a load on their back like a typical barbell, things like that. So rather than worrying about, hey, if we don't have the right technique, like, we're in a good position here. So this is a safe move for our athletes. We can load this up relatively heavy. If you look at this, I think Olivia is probably holding about 100 pounds, probably somewhere between 90 and 100 pounds in her hands between the two kettlebells. What's great about that is she's doing 100 pounds on one leg. If we equate that to a back squat with both legs, that would be 200 pounds, which would be a great back squat for a female. But we can get that without having to put a barbell on her back and put a load on her spine and compress her spine and all that kind of stuff. Like, man, this is a much better option, and it's way more athletic. It allows us to get into better positions. So that's that. That's part of the rear foot elevated split squat. We also use single leg deadlifts. So that's another way that we can pick up some weight as appropriate on one leg. So the overall totality of what we're picking up is lighter, but it allows us to work more efficiently, and it's a little more difficult. So we work on that, because when we look at the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, there's a study from Spears et al. That showed that unilateral and bilateral training both improve performance and strength with no difference between the groups in the study. What's cool about that is it means basically if there's no difference between training on two legs or one leg, why then would we not train more on one leg? Because it allows us to not only get stronger, it allows us to work on balance and mobility as well. So absolutely we should work on one leg, because then we don't get bilateral deficits. One leg's stronger than the other and pushing, and so we get a ton of benefit, a ton of bang for our buck here. So that's strength training. And then on to change of conditioning. So change of direction conditioning. Let's try that again. When you look at this similar picture of what we saw earlier, now what we do here is a little bit different in that we are working on conditioning. So we want our athletes to condition every single time that they're in. We do that so that way we can get them into the right patterns every single time as best we can, and then we just continue to run them, right? So as appropriate, we put them through shuttles and line drills and such. That way we simulate as much as we can of the field or court sport, so that way they get that feel, they get some competitive juices flowing, they're working hard, but we're working on fundamental patterns at the same time. So change of direction conditioning is super important. We want to focus on making those directional changes when we're tired, so that pattern is programmed into the brain. So that's the deal with that. That's number 5. So that is the 5 things that we talked about, especially from an ACL reduction, injury reduction perspective. Now, that's all great. We've kind of talked about this throughout, but you also want your athlete to get faster, and we know that. So totally agree. We talked about this in the beginning, though. If we have athletes that move well, we can reduce the risk of injury. We can also help their performance. We see improvements. And what we do is with our athletes, every single time that they come in and start up a 12-week session, we have them do a 10-yard dash, a vertical jump, a broad jump, and a pro agility drill. So the 10-yard dash is an acceleration tool. So we see that because that's what we end up doing a lot in sport. We have a vertical jump test. We want to check their power there vertically. We have a broad jump, long jump test that we look at power linearly. And then we also have a pro agility drill, which observes their change of direction. How can they take off, stop, change direction? So that's what we look at for that. We measure those things, and we see significant increases in our athletes every time they're in the 12 weeks, because we work on the things that are important, help them move in those patterns, but we also help them to progressively grow each time they're in. So we work on locking in patterns and developing fundamental techniques, but then we start to challenge and we start to make it a little tougher. And then we add a little bit more to it, and a little bit more and a little bit more. And we continue to do that over time. And we run a lot. We sprint a lot. Let me take that back. We don't run a lot. We sprint a lot because we want to accelerate, because that's what happens in sport. And when we think about our athletes, sprinting is actually the most powerful thing that we can do, because there is nothing else that we do in sport or in the weight room or anywhere else that you can do 10 meters per second like you can sprinting. So we take a lot of time to sprint and to teach technique over and over and over again, so that way we can make sure that our athletes get in the right positions and continue to get better over time. The key to this, all of this, is to be consistent and committed, right? To take consistent and committed action. We want to make sure that our athletes are in. For us, we work with athletes generally for 2 or 3 days a week. In the off season, in the summer, we'll go 3 to 4 days, just depending on where they're at. And if your athlete does that, they're going to see significant improvements. They'll see improvement in what they're doing. And so it's a matter of continuing to do it over and over and over again, and then progressively make it a little bit more difficult when you get better at each individual thing. So that is a big part of what we do. It's just continuing to show up and to continue to get a little better every single time. So that is the gist of what we have, right? When we look at from a training perspective, every single time our athletes are in, we are working on speed. We are working on those 5 things that we talked about. We do a dynamic warm-up that's coach-led. We do our jumping and training landing. We do a jumping and landing training. We do our power. We do strength training every single time we're in, and we do conditioning every single time we're in. So that's what's really important. If you look at this, here are a couple of our parents that have, for female athletes in particular, that have made comments and posts about what we have done for their athletes. We've worked with a significant amount, and we continue to grow in that realm. We love working with athletes, and we love when parents say great things, because not only does it mean good things for us, but it means their athlete is getting better and they can make a better impact on everything that they do, and that can make a huge impact in their life. So that is a couple of the things that people are saying about us there. So that's the deal. So I really appreciate you tuning in. I can stop this now. I really appreciate you tuning in and watching this. We love working with athletes. We love working with female athletes in particular, because they can see significant change overall in a relatively short amount of time. Mostly because they listen and they pay attention to what we are saying as coaches. And so they're willing to take advice, and that creates a tremendous opportunity for them to grow quickly. So we love working with female athletes. If you have a female athlete, we would love to help you to help them get better. So we are doing a special offer. This is good for 24 hours if you watch this. And between now, so today is 2/19, 6:45 p.m., and the offer is this: you can take 10% off of training if you come to Movement Fitness if you are in the area. 10%, Speed 10. Speed 10 is your discount code. If you are interested in coming and training at Movement Fitness and seeing what we do, we would love to help you and help your athlete to become the best that they can be. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, you can email me, justin@movementfitnessrockford.com. Love to help answer anything. You can follow me on Instagram @Coach Keg. We also, that's KEG. And then we also have our Movement Fitness Instagram, which is Movement815. And you can find us on Facebook, Movement Fitness Rockford, and Coach Justin Kegley. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And don't forget, as always, to be great today.